Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 37 in my ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. As always, this episode is meant to stand on its own to the extent that that's possible, meaning I want you to be able to listen to it and get something out of it without having to go back and listen to all 36 previous episodes first. However, it is part of a series for a reason, and it's also intended to be part of a larger whole. So if you want the full context for this episode, that context can be found in previous episodes of this series. Over a year ago now, in December 2023, when I started planning the end of history, I initially outlined it for 10 episodes, believing I could quickly cover the background information as an afterthought, and jump right into the events of the 1980s and 90s as the meat of the podcast relatively quickly. But as I sat down to actually start writing the individual episodes, I found myself unable to bring myself to sacrifice context for brevity. And so what I initially intended to be a relatively brief series transformed into what this has become. Essentially, a history of the entire Soviet period, though those earlier episodes still include far less detail than my more recent episodes, as my focus is still to explain how and why the Soviet Union collapsed, and how that helped to create not just modern Russia, but how it shaped the modern world that we all live in. All along, as I added additional context and expanded my outline to include many more episodes than I had initially intended, I was still working from the same outline and planning my episodes in the order of events that I had initially outlined when I wrote that first outline back in December 2023. And back then, I intended to very briefly touch on some basic background on East Germany and the Berlin Wall when I got to the episode on the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is what I promised you last time I would cover today. I am going to break that promise and instead cover some of the background on events in Germany after World War II and throughout the Cold War to give you the necessary context for the fall of the Berlin Wall, which I promise, come hell or high water, I will get to next time. If I were to go back and start this series over today, knowing what I know now about the direction it would go, I probably would have covered events in East Germany and Berlin in much more detail much earlier in the podcast. But since no one has yet managed to invent a time machine, I cannot literally go back in time and re-outline the series. Instead, I will figuratively take you back in time from where we left off in 1989 and pick up in 1945, as the guns fell silent across Europe and the Soviets and their erstwhile allies struggled to reach a settlement on what to do with their defeated German enemy. This is The End of History, Part 37. Just in case any of my listeners have been living in a particularly dark, damp space underneath a very large rock, we recently had a presidential election in my country, the United States. In spite of the scandals, criminal indictments, and various other controversies, or some would argue because of them, Donald J. Trump has just become the second person in American history to serve non-consecutive terms as president. Grover Cleveland is the other, for anyone looking to impress your friends with a bit of American history trivia. Like most Americans, I have some pretty strong opinions and feelings about this transition to a second Trump presidency. I will leave most of those opinions out of this podcast, as they aren't relevant to what I'm trying to do here. But one aspect of this current political environment in the United States that I think does tie into my work on this podcast, and that I find particularly disturbing, is the tendency toward black and white political thinking, and a dismissal of anybody who attempts to inject any nuance into the conversation. Now, this is true to some extent on both the political left and the political right in the United States, but I have to call it like I see it. This kind of black and white, with us or against us mindset is far more prevalent on the American right, especially among supporters of the president. President Trump, for example, likes to use communist, socialist, and fascist interchangeably to describe his opposition. Never mind that fascism is generally considered a right-wing ideology, I can give the benefit of the doubt that people are just lumping authoritarians together and rejecting authoritarianism. That's great, and I agree we should reject that. What bothers me more is who he and his supporters are describing this way, because it is generally used as a pejorative for liberal Democrats. It fails to draw any distinction between left-of-center ideologies, and both the president and scores of his supporters have taken to identifying anybody to the left of Mitt Romney as a Marxist. During the campaign cycle, one acquaintance of mine referred casually to Kamala Harris as a Maoist, just like the Stasi in the GDR. GDR being the acronym for German Democratic Republic or East Germany, and the Stasi being their secret police, and neither of which have anything to do with Maoism. Kamala Harris, a Maoist. I'm always open to a lively political debate. I realize that a lot of political differences are subjective. If someone disagrees with my politics, I can still respect that person and even be friends with them. But some things are not subjective. Some opinions are just factually incorrect. And if you think that Kamala Harris is a Maoist, it's time to get off social media and out into the real world. Mainstream Democrats are small L liberals that in many European countries would actually be considered a center-right party. There are some on the party's left wing who have described themselves as socialist, but I have yet to hear Bernie Sanders call for seizing the means of production. Actual Marxists do exist in the United States, but they are a minuscule proportion of the electorate. And, surprise, they actually ran their own candidate for president and didn't support the Democrats. My point is that there is a lot of nuance here. Left and right are a spectrum, and not an either-or proposition. Most Democrats are not socialists. Many socialists are not Marxists. Many Marxists are not Leninists. And most Marxist-Leninists are not Maoists. Those of you who have been with me for a long time remember that back in the early episodes of this podcast, when I talked about the Russian Revolution, there were a number of different socialist ideologies at play there. Early on, the Bolsheviks, whose ideology would come to be known as Marxism-Leninism, were a minority group swimming in a diverse sea of socialist parties, with the early politics of the revolution being dominated by the Mensheviks, an alternative Marxist school of thought, and the socialist revolutionaries, who combined elements of Marxism with much older ideas of rural agrarian socialism. Because Lenin and the Bolsheviks ultimately came out of the struggle on top, those other socialist parties were eventually eliminated, or co-opted into the Bolsheviks, which became the Communist Party. On a global scale, the triumph of the Bolshevik Revolution also brought many leftists around to Lenin's way of thinking. But competing ideas on the far left of the political spectrum did not cease to exist. And particularly in the parliamentary democracies of Europe, non-Leninist socialist parties continued to thrive, and even win elections. This black and white thinking, especially when it comes to the view of socialism in the United States, of course has a lot to do with our history, and the way the Cold War has been taught to us in school and framed in our culture. If you were to ask the average American on the street, even a rather well-educated one, what the Cold War was about, they would probably tell you, if they knew anything about it at all, that it was an ideological struggle between the competing ideologies of capitalism and communism. That's not necessarily a wrong answer, but the truth is, it was a lot more complicated than that. America definitely experienced the Cold War in that context, and it was reflected in the black and white thinking of, for instance, the McCarthy hearings in Congress, where Senator Joe McCarthy conducted a witch hunt for secret communists that had infiltrated American society. The Soviet Union likewise experienced the Cold War as an either-or proposition. If you were not a loyal Marxist-Leninist, you were a capitalist, and your views were suppressed as dangerous. But this was not necessarily the case in the countries that were on the front line of the Cold War, where the question of ideology was much more nuanced. One such country is Germany. It took me a while, but I did finally get to the point, as I always do. It is one of the great ironies of the Cold War, at least when cast in the light of an American-centric worldview, that two of the most important leaders who stood on opposing sides of the divided Germany were both Marxist socialists who had opposed the Nazi regime. Willy Brandt, the mayor of West Berlin from 1957 to 1966, and Chancellor of West Germany from 1969 to 1974, and Walter Ulbricht, the first secretary of the East German Communist Party from 1950 to 1971. It was only in the nuances that the difference in their ideology was to be found, and yet those nuances turned out to be incredibly important. West Germany, though dominated by left-wing politics and governed for much of its history by socialists, was a member of NATO, a close ally of the United States, and boasted a thriving capitalist economy and a vibrant multi-party democracy. East Germany, on the other hand, was an authoritarian communist state, one of the most repressive in the Eastern Bloc, governed by leaders who were even more uncompromising in their ideology than those of the Soviet Union. Nuance matters. Details matter. Shades of gray are everywhere. The division of Germany itself was never official, but came out as a result of a series of compromises between the competing victorious powers after World War II. In the summer of 1945, when the Allied leaders came together at Potsdam, just outside Berlin, to create a new post-war world, Germany was a ruin. Much of her urban landscape had been reduced to rubble by relentless bombing and the Allied invasion of Germany from two sides. The German people stood dazed in a state of utter defeat, the likes of which has seldom been experienced by any people, anywhere. Germany's Nazi leaders had insisted on fighting fanatically to the end, well after defeat had become inevitable, and in the process, they sacrificed their own country on the altar of total war. There was no functioning economy. Just about everything, including food, was in short supply. And in Berlin and elsewhere, the money was so worthless that cigarettes were used as a de facto currency. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, the Allied leaders Stalin, Truman, and Churchill, who was voted out and replaced by Labour Party leader Clement Attlee midway through the conference, met to hammer out the details of the Allied occupation of Germany. I discussed the Potsdam Conference from the perspective of the budding Cold War back in episode 11, for anyone who wants to revisit that. It was decided that Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones, with the Americans, British, and French occupying what would become West Germany, and the Soviets occupying what would become East Germany. I will try to throw some maps up on the website for anyone who is interested. Berlin, though it was deep inside the Soviet zone, would likewise be divided into occupation zones, with the Western Allies each getting a zone, and the Soviets getting a zone. Again, I'll try to link to a good map on my website for anyone who wants to see the breakdown of what those occupation zones looked like. Ordinary Germans feared the Soviets, and there was, throughout the summer of 1945, a huge movement of people to the west. German refugees who had been pushed out of the territory that had been stripped from Germany and given to Poland, as well as from other areas that had been occupied by the Nazis, rushed westward into eastern Germany, and those who were able did what they could to get out of the Soviet occupation zone. The fears were well-founded. There were, of course, some atrocities committed by American, British, and especially French troops as they swept into Germany and became its occupiers, but they were relatively infrequent and paled in comparison to the onslaught of Soviet troops in Germany. Sexual violence against German women was particularly rampant. Thievery and murder were also common. The Soviets were exacting revenge for the unprecedented wave of crime and cruelty that the Germans had inflicted on their country. The Soviets also exacted revenge economically. As had been agreed at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, the Soviets would be allowed to claim war reparations from Germany in kind. This meant that even before the German army surrendered, the Soviets began systematically stripping every part of Germany their soldiers occupied of its material wealth. Entire industries were broken down, loaded onto trains, and shipped back to the Soviet Union. The stripping of wealth would have important long-term consequences, especially considering Western Germany was already significantly wealthier and more developed than the eastern portion occupied by the Soviets. In 1946 and 1947, the Americans began implementing the Marshall Plan all over Europe, including in Germany, which meant investing large quantities of money in the reconstruction and economic recovery of the country. Despite an expressed intent for these funds to go to all of Germany and not just the portions under Western occupation, The Soviets were by this time deeply suspicious of American motives, and none of this foreign aid reached the East. This meant that although economic conditions were bad throughout Germany, they were significantly worse in East Germany. And so by 1948, we were left with a situation where the western part of Germany, under Western occupation, was experiencing a significant economic recovery, and conditions of life were constantly improving. By contrast, in the East, though there was some recovery, the conditions of life were much slower to improve. The division of Germany was never meant to be permanent, but rather a temporary situation where the Allies cooperated with one another in peace, as they had in war, to govern the country until a new government could be established for the whole country. But Stalin, as he had in other countries of Eastern and Central Europe that the Soviets occupied, immediately began strategically placing communists loyal to Moscow in positions of power in the Soviet zone. Walter Ulbricht led a group of German communists and socialists, most of whom had taken refuge from the Nazi regime in the Soviet Union, in establishing control over East Germany on Stalin's behalf. Ulbricht famously described the communist project in the Soviet occupation zone that would become East Germany, saying, quote, "It has to look democratic, but we must hold everything in our hands." End quote. What this looked like in practice was that figureheads were appointed from the so-called bourgeois democratic parties to serve as the face of the new administration. But Ulbricht made sure that they each had a deputy who was a committed communist that would work behind the scenes and wield the real power. It was also ensured that the security and police forces in the Soviet zone were firmly in the control of communists. The process of securing communist rule in East Germany was gradual, similar to the process in other Eastern Bloc states. Elections were even held to maintain a democratic pretense in 1946. The Social Democratic Party was forced to merge with the Communists to form a unified socialist front, which would eventually purge itself of Social Democrats and become the ruling Communist Party of East Germany, known formally as the Socialist Unity Party of Germany. Then, Soviet occupation authorities, while allowing other parties to continue to exist, strong-armed them into joining a governing coalition, with the Communists at its head. Slowly but surely, these parties, and any influence they may have wielded, were absorbed into the ruling Communist Party. The German Democratic Republic, known colloquially as East Germany, was formally declared on October 7, 1949. It was yet another one-party Marxist-Leninist state. The declaration was a response to the formation of the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, in May of that same year. Similar to North and South Korea today, a situation that has its roots in a similar situation, neither Germany recognized the other, and both claimed sovereignty as the legitimate government over all of Germany. But due to the dynamics of the Cold War, neither Germany was in a position to assert these claims, and relatively quickly, this political reality solidified into the de facto partition of Germany into two separate states. Even before the declaration of these two German states, crossing between East and West was difficult in most places. But after the formal division of the country, the border became increasingly militarized and harder to cross. In 1953, with people emboldened by the death of Stalin, a series of demonstrations against the communist regime began in East Berlin, and soon spread throughout East Germany. The East German regime might have been toppled had it not been for swift Soviet intervention, which quickly and violently crushed the uprising. In its aftermath, the East Germans began to harden their border even more, and by 1955 it was virtually impossible to pass from East to West Germany in most places. The one major exception to this hardening of the border was in Berlin. Berlin's situation after the war was a little bit different from the rest of Germany, because although the city was located deep within the Soviet occupation zone, the Allies had agreed at Potsdam that the German capital would be, like the larger country, divided into zones and jointly occupied. The British, Americans, and French each got a zone in the western part of the city, and the Soviets occupied the eastern part of the city. And so West Berlin became like a thorn in the side of East Germany, an outpost of the Western democracies deep inside the Eastern Bloc. In 1948, Stalin had determined to resolve this problem by forcing his erstwhile allies to withdraw from Berlin by blockading the city. Rather than try to push the Westerners out by force, the Soviets simply cut off their lines of supply, closing the rail, road, and canal links to West Berlin from West Germany. Rather than back down and abandon West Berlin, the British and the Americans, particularly the Americans, responded with one of the great logistical efforts of the 20th century, the Berlin Airlift. When the story of the Cold War is told through an American-centric lens, the Berlin Airlift is usually portrayed as one of the great American triumphs of the Cold War, often forgetting that the UK and other European countries were also involved in the effort. American-centric narratives aside, however, the airlift was something of a triumph for the West. Beyond Stalin's wildest expectations, over 10,000 tons of supplies were flown into West Berlin airfields daily between April 24, 1948 and September 30, 1949. There were shortages and other difficulties, but West Berlin endured. More than that, the monumental humanitarian effort made by the West to keep Berlin alive convinced many West Germans, and West Berliners in particular, that they were more than just pawns in a geopolitical chess game, that the West really did care about them. It eased the process of West Germany's integration into the growing transatlantic alliance. Most importantly, it meant that West Berlin would remain an enclave of the democratic West within the communist East. In the fall of 1949, realizing his blockade had failed to dislodge the Westerners from Berlin, Stalin backed down and reopened the land and water routes between West Germany and Berlin. Throughout the occupation, blockade, and after, Berlin was administratively divided between Western and Soviet authorities, but it was not physically divided the way the rest of Germany was. It remained a single city, and crossing between the Western and Soviet sectors was relatively easy. This made Berlin one of the last places that people from East Germany could cross into the West, prior to the construction of the wall at least. And leave they did. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people took advantage of the so-called Berlin loophole to flee to the West. Estimates vary, but it is generally settled upon that between 2 and 2.5 million people fled East Germany for the West between 1955 and 1961, which accounted for roughly 10 to 15% of the country's population. Exact numbers are hard to nail down, but some historians even estimate that as much as 20% of the East German population fled to the West during this time. This kind of population hemorrhaging would be economically ruinous for almost any country, but it was even worse for East Germany when you consider who was leaving. The narrative I was taught in school was that these people fled the communist East to get away from political persecution out of an objection to authoritarian communist rule and a commitment to democracy. Now, it's not my place to question any individual's motivation for leaving East Germany, and there is often a close relationship between one's economic and political beliefs. But the data that I have seen suggests that on a macro level at least, the exodus was fueled by economic rather than ideological considerations. By and large, the people who fled were the highly educated and skilled professionals who could take advantage of greater opportunities in the West. By the mid-1950s, kick-started by the American Marshall Plan investment, the economy in West Germany was not only recovering from its post-war depression, but actually becoming one of the more productive economies in Europe. East Germany, by contrast, had a number of economic disadvantages compared to its Western counterpart. First, the vast majority of Germany's heavy industry was located in the West. The East, by comparison, was predominantly agrarian. Second, the East had not received the shot of American investment as a result of the Marshall Plan like the West had. And finally, the Soviets had systematically stripped East Germany of its wealth and shipped it back to the Soviet Union in the late 40s, a process characterized as in-kind reparations. Those of you who are familiar with my podcast know that I have been very critical of the socialist economic model, and I think the evidence overwhelmingly shows that a capitalist market economy, though flawed, is superior to a planned socialist economy. But before a bunch of Marxist-Leninists start to at me on social media again, in the case of Germany, the difference in economic model was probably not the main reason for the economic disparity, at least early on. But the reality was that disparity existed, and Germans with advanced degrees or specialized skills could command a superior salary and enjoy infinitely more opportunity in West Germany. For example, doctors and nurses made up a disproportionate number of those who fled from east to west, as did scientists and engineers. Walter Ulbricht had floated the idea of sealing off West Berlin with a physical barrier to stop these defections as early as 1955, but deferred to Soviet leadership when it came to managing the border with West Berlin. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader at the time, was wary of pushing the Western powers too far on the issue of Berlin, and believed he could force the West to back down and abandon West Berlin by diplomatic means. I talked a little bit about this when I covered the Cuban Missile Crisis, episode 19 for anyone who wants to revisit that, but Khrushchev severely misjudged and underestimated his adversary in John F. Kennedy, the newly elected American president. Khrushchev believed that the relatively young and inexperienced Kennedy could essentially be bullied into making concessions. The most important manifestation of this misjudgment was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I've already covered at length. But another byproduct of Khrushchev's faulty assumptions was the so-called Berlin Crisis in the summer of 1962. When the two leaders first met in Vienna that summer, Khrushchev took an aggressive stance toward resolving what he called the German question. His proposal was that the USSR and the Western powers would each sign separate peace treaties with East and West Germany, recognizing them as separate and sovereign countries, rather than as a single government over the whole of Germany. He proposed that in this scenario, Berlin would be included in neither country, but rather designated as an independent free city. Kennedy was unwilling to accept Khrushchev's proposal, convinced as he was that the withdrawal of American troops from West Berlin would inevitably lead to it being absorbed into East Germany, whether that was the agreement or not, since the city would be left defenseless deep inside communist-held territory. Khrushchev sought to force his proposal by presenting it as an ultimatum. If Kennedy failed to accept by December 31, 1961, he said the Soviet Union would sign a unilateral peace treaty with East Germany, recognizing them as the sole legitimate government over all of Germany, and negating the prior agreements between the occupiers on the division of Berlin and the status of Western troops there. According to his son, Sergei, Khrushchev took this aggressive stance not to provoke a conflict, but to prevent one. Sergei later recalled that his father told him, quote, "I exaggerated the situation in order to put the Americans in an untenable situation and force them to admit that our proposals made good sense. Otherwise, a conflict would occur." End quote. Kennedy did not back down in the face of Khrushchev's aggressive posture in Vienna, but he did make statements that some American diplomats and historians have regarded as a mistake, born of his inexperience in foreign affairs. I think that's debatable. But what isn't debatable is that Kennedy's statements on Berlin at the Vienna summit constituted a fundamental shift in American policy on Berlin from the Eisenhower administration. He acknowledged American acquiescence to a permanent division of the city, telling Khrushchev that American priorities in Berlin amounted to the security of Western troops in West Berlin, the security and viability of the western part of the city, and the continued access to West Berlin from West Germany. This differentiated from Eisenhower's policy in that Kennedy's stated objectives were all limited to West Berlin, which he spoke of as holding a separate and distinct status from East Berlin. Soviet diplomats interpreted this as the Americans agreeing not to oppose Soviet action taken in Berlin so long as it was limited to their sector of the city. Khrushchev eventually backed down from his ultimatum, refusing to take any action that he thought might trigger a shooting war with the Western powers. But he did take Kennedy at his word that there would be no interference from the Americans in East Berlin, and he approved the construction of a barrier to permanently close that border, which Ulbricht and the East German leadership had been advocating for some time. On August 12, 1961, Soviet and East German military units began tearing up roads, filling in subway tunnels, and constructing barbed wire barriers across Berlin. A lot of criticism has been leveled against the Kennedy administration over the years for not taking bolder action to stop the construction of these barriers and the closing of the border across Berlin, arguing that a show of force might have made the Soviets back down and prevented the construction of the wall. But such a show of force could have triggered a war with the Soviet Union, and strictly speaking, the Soviets were not violating any agreements they had made about the administration of Berlin by constructing the wall. The entirety of the barrier was being built inside the Soviet occupation zone, and the crucial checkpoints to allow American, British, and French officials to cross the border for official purposes remained in place, the most famous of which was Checkpoint Charlie. To put it succinctly, there was nothing the Western powers could have done to prevent the wall's construction without themselves violating the agreements made with the USSR. The Americans and British both reinforced their garrison in Berlin to deter any potential Soviet action in the Western Zone, but they ultimately stood by and watched as the most infamous symbol of the Cold War was erected right in front of them. With the construction of the Berlin Wall and the closing of the border in Berlin, the last link available for ordinary Germans between East and West was closed. In 1960 alone, roughly 200,000 people had crossed into the West from East Germany through Berlin. Between 1961 and 1989, only about 5,000 people would manage to escape west across the Berlin Wall. Approximately 100 were killed in the attempt. The Soviets and their East German allies tried their best through propaganda to sanitize what they were doing, alleging that the wall was really meant to protect their socialist project from fascists intent on interfering with it. Indeed, East German officials referred to the wall as the anti-fascist protection rampart. But this propaganda rang hollow. It was obvious to any objective observer that the wall was meant to keep people in, not to protect them. Even Nikita Khrushchev reluctantly admitted in his memoirs that the optics of the wall were bad, because it made socialism look inferior to capitalism because they were forced to keep people in with a wall. He of course blamed the Americans for the necessity of its construction because they had refused his proposals for separate peace treaties with the two Germanys, but he at least acknowledged that it wasn't a good look. The reality of the wall was painfully obvious. Families were separated. People who had happened to be on the wrong side when the wall went up found themselves stranded, unable to get home. It was common for people to work in West Berlin where the wages were higher and live in East Berlin where the cost of living was lower. Thousands of people found themselves trapped on one side or the other when the wall went up. Regardless of which side of the wall they found themselves on, millions of ordinary Germans were left contemplating an uncertain future on the front lines of the Cold War. Those left on the eastern side of the German divide found themselves living in one of the most repressive states in history. There have been a number of regimes that were more brutal and bloodthirsty than East Germany. The East German authorities, with their country having just survived being on the losing end of 2 world wars, had little appetite for the wholesale slaughter of their own people. But there have been few states in history with an enforcement apparatus as ruthlessly efficient as East Germany's Ministry for State Security, commonly known as the Stasi. While Ulbricht was in charge, the Stasi followed the familiar role of the NKVD or the KGB. They were more of a blunt instrument than a precision tool, simply used to intimidate, arrest, and eliminate the state's alleged enemies. But after Walter Ulbricht was replaced as first secretary by Erich Honecker in 1971, the Stasi's tactics changed. Stalinist terror was no longer in vogue by the 1970s, and the Stasi's tactics evolved from brutal to diabolical, but somewhat less brutal. They employed a strategy against the state's perceived enemies known as Zersetzung, a German word meaning decomposition or disruption. The point of this tactic was rather than to simply intimidate the victim or make them disappear, to systematically break down their psychological well-being until they were completely discredited and their lives were ruined. One detailed Stasi report on a peace activist, Ulrike Poppe, detailed their plan to break her down psychologically by systematically destroying her marriage and turning her son against her. In another case, activist Vera Lengsfeld's entire life turned out to be an undercover Stasi operation. She ended up marrying and having 2 children with a man who it turned out was a Stasi agent assigned to spy on her. Throughout their marriage, he dutifully reported everything about her to his Stasi handlers. Every illness, every emotional vulnerability, her sleep patterns, even her intimate preferences, were all in her Stasi file, given to them by their man on the inside, her husband. By 1985, the Stasi had around 105,000 full-time employees, making it one of the largest employers in East Germany, and is estimated to have employed over 500,000 informants who reported on their fellow citizens. According to Victor Sebastian, in the mid-1980s, there was a Stasi officer or informant for every 63 people in East Germany. Of course, as we see with all the former Eastern Bloc states, life in East Germany was not always a complete nightmare. In fact, there are still people in Germany today who express nostalgia for the GDR. Like in other socialist states, there was a certain level of guaranteed economic security in East Germany that was appreciated by many. The state guaranteed them a job, housing, and all the basic necessities of life. Though the higher standard of living that was available to their brethren in the West was not attainable for them, they also didn't have to live with fear of falling into abject poverty, living secure in the knowledge that the socialist state's strong social safety net would catch them and provide for them. Many from the generation that had experienced the utter humiliation of their country's total defeat in the Second World War and the years of chaos and economic depression that followed it, this security was enough. But by the 1980s, a new generation of Germans was coming of age, a generation that bore none of the guilt and had no memory of the country's Nazi past or of the defeat and the privation that followed it. Many of these young East Germans were exposed to Western music and fashion, which they grew to love and were eager to emulate. They stared across the wall at the freedoms and luxuries that their Western counterparts had and longed to be integrated into that world. Beginning on June 6, 1987, David Bowie and various other artists played a 3-day concert in West Berlin that was strategically placed near the wall so that it could also be heard in the east. A large crowd gathered around a nearby gate on the east side of the wall on the second night, which was headlined by Bowie, and could be heard singing along with Bowie's songs. East German police pushed the crowd back and made several arrests, but the following night, the crowd was even bigger, and eventually broke into irrepressible chants of, "The wall must come down," and "Gorby, get us out." Gorby, of course, referred to Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, whose reforms also inspired this new generation of East Germans. It would still be more than 2 years before the wall finally did come down, but the concert was something of a canary in the coal mine for the East German regime. It showed that there was a new generation that was not ready to tolerate the status quo, which was unwilling to trade freedom for security. The wall had kept East Germany closed off from the West for a quarter of a century, but as reform emanated out of the Soviet Union to its satellite states, a new wind was blowing. And though the East German authorities would be among the most stubborn resistors, by 1989, events in Hungary would begin a chain reaction that proved beyond even their ability to control. The revolution was spreading to East Germany, and that revolution will be the subject of my next episode. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. If you like what you heard and you want to support the show, you can help us out by becoming a patron on Patreon. You can find our Patreon page at patreon.com/historyspherepodcast. The History Sphere is a one-man project produced by me, myself, and I, which I do because I love history and I want to share that with you. I will continue to share it with you even if you can't afford to pay me. But if you like the show and you can afford it, becoming a patron is a great way to show your appreciation. You can also find a link to the Patreon on the show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. On that website, you will also find links to the show's social media and streaming platforms, as well as a list of my sources for this episode. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. Next time, on the History Sphere, I promise that I will finally cover the long-awaited fall of the Berlin Wall. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.